Montana Territory, late autumn of 1881. The wind cut sharper than a knife, and Willow Tamerlin hadn't eaten in days. She crouched behind a crumbling stone wall that once edged a stagecoach route, her skirt torn at the hem and her boots caked in dried mud. Her ribs ached from coughing, her lips cracked from cold, and her stomach had long since stopped growling. Hunger was a quiet thing now, sitting hollow in her chest like a ghost. Willow had walked nearly 40 miles east of Fort Benton, away from the burned-out cabin where her sister's fever had taken her. The last of their food had gone to her sister's mouth, even when Willow knew it was too late. She hadn't expected to survive, not really. But something in her kept walking. She hadn't expected to see smoke curling from a chimney, nor the shape of a man standing in the yard of a small ranch house, chopping wood with the steady rhythm of someone who had known hard days and lived through them. Willow stayed low, watching. Her hands trembled from cold and weakness. She knew better than to trust strangers, especially men, but she also knew she was out of choices. The man turned and she ducked. Too late. "Hey!" His voice carried clear across the yard. "You all right?" She didn't answer. Her legs wouldn't let her run. He set the axe down gently, like he didn't want to spook her, and walked a few steps closer. He wore a thick coat, lined with wool, and a hat pulled low over his dark hair. His voice was steady, not loud, not threatening. "You look about starved," he said. "My name's Quillan Rhodes. I ain't gonna hurt you." Willow swallowed hard. Her voice cracked like dry wood. I don't want trouble." "Well, you already found me," he said, and there was a smile in his voice, warm and easy. "And I got a plate that's been waiting for you. Come inside." She blinked at him. "Why would you feed me?" "You look like you need it," Quillan said. Then he added quieter, "And no one should go hungry if I can help it." Her knees gave out before she could answer. The world tilted, and she felt herself fall, but arms caught her, strong and careful. "Easy," he murmured, lifting her like she weighed nothing at all. "Let's get you inside." The warmth hit her first. Then the smell: bacon grease, fresh bread, something sweet. She was in a kitchen, small but clean, with a wood stove humming and a kettle hissing gently. Quillan laid her down on a cot near the fire. He pulled a thick quilt over her and crouched nearby, studying her face. "You got a name?" he asked. She nodded, barely. "Willow. Willow Tamerlin." "Well, Willow," he said, "you're safe here. I'm gonna get you some food." He moved around the kitchen with quiet efficiency. She watched through half-lidded eyes as he plated eggs, biscuits, and stewed apples. He poured her water, then spooned some coffee into a tin cup and added milk. He set the plate in front of her like it was the most natural thing in the world. "My plate's been waiting for you." Her eyes burned. She couldn't remember the last time someone had fed her without asking something in return. Willow sat up slowly, her hands shaking so bad she dropped the fork once. Quillan didn't say a word. He just picked it up and placed it gently back in her hand. "Take your time," he said. She ate in silence, one bite at a time. Her eyes stayed on him, half waiting for the catch. But there was none. He just sat across from her, drinking coffee and watching the fire. When her plate was clean, she leaned back against the cot, her cheeks flushed with warmth and shame. "I didn't mean to collapse in your yard," she said. "You didn't collapse," he said. "You just stopped walking." She looked at him. "That's supposed to be better?" He shrugged. "Maybe not, but I'm glad you got far enough to reach me." The next morning, she woke to the smell of biscuits again. Outside, the sky was gray with snow. Quillan was at the stove, humming low under his breath. He glanced over his shoulder when he heard her stir. "Morning," he said. "You're looking better." She sat up, rubbing her eyes. "How long was I asleep?" "Most of yesterday. You needed it." Willow didn't know what to make of him. He was kind, quiet, and never asked questions she did not want to answer. But after breakfast, when she offered to help with the horses or the woodpile, he nodded without hesitation and handed her gloves. Felt good to work again. "You here alone?" she asked, brushing hay from her skirt as they finished in the barn. "For now," he said. "Had a brother once. He went south a few years back. Got married. This place was my father's. He passed last winter." "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. Quillan nodded. "Me too." She noticed how he looked at the land not with bitterness, but with the weight of someone who carried it forward out of love. That night, after supper, they sat near the fire. Willow curled her legs under her, listening to the wind scratch at the shutters. "You looking to move on?" he asked quietly. Willow stayed quiet a moment. "I do not have anywhere to go." He looked over at her, his eyes steady. "Well, you have here." She met his gaze, and something inside her chest shifted. It was not love yet, not quite, but it was something close. 2 days passed, then 3. Snow came soft and thick, covering the ground like a blanket. She helped mend a fence, patch a saddle, and once, when Quillan's hands slipped chopping kindling, she cleaned the cut and wrapped it gently. "You always this stubborn?" he asked, watching her fuss over him. "You always this bad at chopping wood?" She shot back and he grinned. That night he made stew and cornbread, and she laughed for the first time in months. Surprised them both. "You have a nice laugh," he said, his voice lower now. She looked at him, really looked. The firelight made his face softer, gentler. He had a quiet strength about him like the land he worked, steady and unshakable. Willow's chest tightened, but not with fear. With something she had not felt in so long. She barely recognized it. "Hope." "Thank you," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "For what?" "For seeing me. For saving me." Quillan reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, slow and careful, like he was not sure she would let him. But she did. She leaned into his hand, and he smiled. "You saved yourself," he said. "I just opened the door." She shook her head, eyes wet. "I wouldn't have made it to morning." He took her hand in his, squeezing it gently. "Well, I am real glad you did." The first real snow came in the night, covering the yard and fields in a silence so complete it made Willow's breath catch when she stepped outside at dawn. The world looked held still, as though waiting for her to decide something. She wore an old wool coat Quillan had found in a trunk, sleeves rolled up, the hem brushing her calves. It smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. He was already out by the corral, checking the fence line where a young roan gelding had been testing the rails. She watched him for a moment, the way he moved efficient, unhurried. He didn't look over his shoulder, but he must have heard her boots crunching in the snow. "Thought you might sleep in," he said, adjusting a length of wire. "Weather's no friend to the bones." "I couldn't sleep," she replied, stepping closer. "Too quiet." Quillan nodded, twisting the wire tight against the post. "Takes some getting used to." She leaned against the fence, fingers curled around the cold top rail. "Did you ever think about selling this place?" His hands paused. Then he stood upright and wiped them on a cloth from his coat pocket. "After Pa died, I did. One of the cattle outfits out west offered to buy the land. Said I'd be better off with a stake in town than dust and fence posts. Why didn't you take it?" He looked past her, toward the cottonwoods lining the creek. "Because he built it with his hands. And because someone ought to stay." She nodded slowly, the cold air stinging her cheeks. "I think my sister would have liked it here." Quillan didn't ask about her. He didn't press. He just said, "Then I'm glad you found your way." They worked side by side the rest of the morning, clearing snow from the barn roof, splitting kindling when the sky started to darken again. That afternoon, Quillan brought out a tin box from a shelf near the hearth. Inside were folded papers, some yellow with age, others bearing neat hand-drawn maps and notations. "My father kept records of everything," he said, setting them between them at the table. "He'd draw the land each season, how it drained, where the elk passed, what fields went fallow." Willow traced a line on one of the parchment sheets with her fingertip. "He must have wanted someone to understand this place the way he did." Quillan looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I think he hoped someone would love it enough to stay." That evening, she stitched a tear in his work shirt while he cleaned his rifle near the fire. Neither spoke for a long while, the quiet between them growing familiar, not heavy. When she pricked her finger, he looked up, ready to help, but she shook her head. "I've had worse," she said, wiping the blood on her skirt. He smiled gently. "Doesn't mean you should bleed alone." She didn't have an answer for that, but she handed him the mended shirt, and he accepted it like it was something valuable. The next morning, she woke to the scent of boiling oats and the low murmur of cattle outside. She dressed quickly, pulled her boots on, and found Quillan in the barn, brushing down the roan. "There's a market in Judith Gap tomorrow," he said without turning. "Takes a day's ride there and back. I'll need to leave early." She nodded. "You want me to watch the place?" "I'd rather you ride with me," he said. "If you're willing." Willow hesitated. "I haven't been around folks in a while." "I know," he said, "but you don't have to say much. Just ride beside me." She met his eyes then, and found a quiet steadiness in them again. Not a push, not a promise. Just a place to stand. "All right," she said. They left before sunup, the horses' hooves muffled in the snow. The trail wound through pine stands and frozen creeks, the mountains rising sharp against the sky. At midday, they stopped near a rocky outcrop, where he handed her a parcel wrapped in oilcloth, cold biscuits, boiled eggs, and dried meat. As they sat side by side on a fallen log, she asked, "Were you always alone, out here?" He shook his head. "Not always. There was a girl once, from Helena. She didn't care much for dirt under her nails or wind in her hair. And you?" "I didn't care much for pretending to be someone else." She watched him carefully. "You don't seem like a man who pretends." "I did for a time," he said. "It gets you through certain doors, but it doesn't keep you warm." Willow looked down at her lap. The wind tugged at loose strands of her hair. "I've pretended, too, that I was stronger than I was, that I didn't need help." "You don't have to do that here," he said. "I'm not sure I know how to stop." He reached over and touched her hand, just once. A simple gesture, but something in her chest went still. "Then we'll learn together," he said. The rest of the ride passed in quiet. At the edge of the town, she hesitated, but he simply nodded to her and rode a little ahead, giving her space. She followed, her back straight, eyes forward. Inside the trading post, she kept close while he bartered for flour, nails, and salt pork. The shopkeeper asked if she was Quillan's wife. Before he could answer, she said, "Not yet." Quillan didn't laugh. He didn't flinch. He just looked at her, long and steady, and said, "We're working toward it." And somehow that was enough. The wind shifted as they rode back from Judith Gap, carrying the scent of damp pine and something deeper beneath it, earth just beginning to thaw beneath the snow. It was late afternoon by the time Quillan guided them off the main trail, following a narrow path he said would cut time but run steeper near the ridge. Willow didn't mind. She liked the quiet between them, the shared rhythm of hooves and breath, the way he never filled silence just to hear his own voice. At the high point, they stopped to rest the horses. Below, the land stretched wide and bare, tawny with winter grass and scattered with the black dots of elk moving slow across the lowlands. Willow pulled her cloak tighter at the throat. I used to think the world ended at the Missouri River, she said, watching the horizon. Everything past it felt like a story someone else lived. Quillan leaned against his saddle, his face touched with sun and wind. And what does it feel like now? She looked at him, eyes catching on the line of his jaw, the faint lines at the corners of his mouth. Like I stepped into something real. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was low. You have. They reached the homestead just after dusk. The kitchen was cold, but the fire in the main room still held coals. Quillan lit the lantern while she unpacked the dry goods, her hands steady now, sure in their work. When she turned, he was standing in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her. I forgot how quiet it gets when the snow's deep, he said. She set down the sack of flour. I don't mind it. He nodded once. You sleep in the big room tonight. Warmer. I'll take the cot. Willow shook her head. I'm not putting you out of your own bed. You're not, he said. I sleep better near the fire anyhow. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. All right. That night, she lay beneath the thick quilt, the scent of wood smoke and pine sap lingering in the fabric. Through the doorway, she saw the soft outline of him in the chair, one boot off, the other half laced. His head tipped back as if he'd meant to rest only a moment. Willow rose quietly, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and stepped into the room. She crouched beside him, brushing his hair back where it had fallen across his brow. He stirred. You need something? No, she said. Just didn't want you to sleep in that chair all night. I've had worse, he murmured, eyes still closed. I know, she answered, but you shouldn't have to. In the days that followed, the snow softened under the sun, revealing patches of frozen earth and brittle grass. They worked the fence line together, drove the cattle from the lower pasture to a windbreak Quillan had built years earlier. Willow never asked to stay, and he never asked her to leave. It settled between them like something already decided. One afternoon, she found him repairing the yoke on the wagon near the barn. His shirt sleeves were rolled back, hands dusted with sawdust. She sat on the edge of the feed barrel, watching the even way he moved. You always know how to fix everything? She asked. No, he said, adjusting the plane. But I know how to try. She hesitated, then said, I used to think needing help meant I'd failed. Quillan didn't look up. And now, I think maybe it's braver to ask than to keep breaking. He finished smoothing the edge of the yoke, then met her eyes. You're not broken, Willow. I was, she said. But I'm not anymore. He stood and wiped his hands on a cloth, then stepped closer. You've changed this place. How? He looked around the yard, then back at her. It feels lighter, like it's waiting for something good. She rose slowly. I've been waiting, too. His hand brushed hers, then held it. Not tentative, not testing, just there, steady and sure. That night, she made supper herself, a pot of beans with salt pork and a bit of molasses she traded for in town. He said nothing while they ate, but afterward, he stood behind her at the wash basin, took the dish towel from her hands, and dried the plates quietly beside her. When they finished, he didn't move away. I want you here, he said, voice rough at the edges. I'm already here, she answered. I mean for good. She turned to face him. You sure? Yes. She studied him in the firelight. Then I'll stay. Quillan reached up and touched her cheek, thumb trailing just beneath her eye. I never thought I'd have someone to come home to. You do now. They stood like that a long while, the house wrapped in warmth that had nothing to do with the hearth. Outside, the wind moved gentle through the trees, as if even the land was at rest. By the first weeks of March, the snow had begun to recede from the south-facing slopes, leaving behind slow rivulets of meltwater that wove between roots and stones like silver veins. The land wasn't green yet, but the scent of thaw was in the air, wet bark, turned soil, and the faint peppery note of sagebrush waking under the sun. Willow stood at the edge of the garden plot, boots sinking into soft ground. She pressed her boot heel into the earth, testing its give, then glanced toward the barn where Quillan was fitting a new strap to the harness mule. She waited until he finished before speaking. "I think we could turn the rows next week," she said, brushing her hands on her apron. "If the frost holds off." Quillan looked up, the brim of his hat casting a narrow shadow across his brow. "I've got seed corn from last season. Beans too. You ever work a garden that size?" "I did once," she said. "Back in Kansas. Before." She didn't finish. There was no need. He gave a small nod and stepped toward her, his coat open, collar damp from the morning's work. "You draw the rows, I'll follow with the plow," he said. "We'll put it in together." That night, she sat by the fire with a length of muslin stretched in a hoop, embroidery needle moving sure through the fabric. Her fingers had regained their steadiness since those first days. She was adding a winding vine along the hem of the curtain she'd sewn for the front window, nothing fancy, just enough to soften the look of the room. Quillan came in with an armful of firewood and paused when he saw her work. "You don't need to do that," he said, setting the logs down near the hearth. "I know," she answered, "but I want to." He didn't press. Instead, he poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed her one, then sat beside her on the bench, silent for a while. "They're sending a new circuit preacher through Fort Shaw next month," he said finally. "He's supposed to make the ride out this way. Folks are planning a gathering for it, picnic, music, that sort of thing." She looked at him over the rim of her mug. "You thinking of going?" "I was," he said. "Maybe we go together." Willow lowered her eyes to the embroidery. "People will wonder." "Let them," he said. She was quiet, the needle paused mid-stitch. Then, softly, "I haven't worn a dress fit for a gathering in over a year." "I'll trade for one," he said. "Or we'll sew it ourselves." "You pick the cloth." She looked at him then, really looked, and something in her face steadied. "All right," she whispered. "I'll go." The next afternoon, they rode together to a neighbor's homestead 5 miles down the ridge. The Archer family, a couple with 3 sons and a flock of chickens that shrieked louder than the boys had traded cloth before. Willow bartered a pair of her stitched linen towels for 3 yards of calico the color of deep plum. On the ride back, she let her hand rest against the saddle horn, watching the hills roll past. "You ever think about children?" she asked, voice even. Quillan didn't startle. "I have." "What kind of father do you think you'd be?" He tugged the reins gently as they passed through a narrow draw. "One who listens. One who stays." She watched him as he rode beside her. "That's enough." Back at the cabin, she set to work on the dress in the evenings, piecing it by lamplight with careful seams. Quillan built her a small table out of scrap pine boards so she wouldn't have to hunch over her sewing in the corner. He didn't mention it when he set it down, just nodded and said, "Try that." When the dress was finished, she laid it across the bed and ran her palm over the bodice. It was plain, but the cut was right, and the color brought out the warmth in her hair. She turned to find him leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You made that." She nodded. "I've never seen you in anything like it," he said. "You will." The morning of the gathering, the sun came up pale and low, casting long lines across the frost-covered grass. Willow stood at the wash basin, brushing her hair with slow, even strokes. She braided it back and pinned it into a coil, her fingers sure now, movements practiced. Quillan waited outside, already saddled and dressed in a clean shirt she'd mended the week before. When she stepped out onto the porch, he straightened without a word. They rode into Fort Shaw just as the preacher was beginning his sermon beneath a canvas tent. People glanced their way, some curious, some friendly, but no one spoke against them. The archers waved them over, and someone passed Willow a tin plate of fried bread and beans. Later, when the music started, Quillan offered his hand. She hesitated only a moment before placing hers in his. They danced slow, steady, the way they worked, learning each other's rhythm one step at a time. As the sun dipped low behind the hills, he leaned close and said, "I want to marry you, Willow." She didn't look away. "Then ask me plain." He swallowed. "Will you build a life with me here? Through summers and winters, through whatever comes." She reached up, touched his face, and smiled, a soft thing, full of light. "Yes, I've already started." The wedding was held 2 weeks later, not under any roof but beneath the wide sky just past where the cottonwoods lined the creek's bend. The preacher rode out from Fort Shaw, coat flapping behind him, and brought a Bible wrapped in oilcloth. Willow wore the calico dress she'd sewn, its hem now let out slightly to fall more cleanly over her boots. Quillan had shaved, though he kept the stubble on his jaw, said it felt strange not to wear the land on his face. They spoke their vows with hands joined and eyes steady. There were no guests beyond the archers and their youngest boy, who handed them a bouquet of rabbitbrush and early crocus pulled from a south-facing patch of earth. When the preacher asked if they would walk together, come sun or snow, they answered in the same breath. Afterward, they walked home side by side, reins held loose, their horses trailing behind. The sky was the color of raw wool, clouds low but not heavy. Quillan glanced at her, his voice quiet but sure. "You ever think you'd marry again?" She looked out over the fields, the rows they turned already dark and ready. "I stopped thinking about it. There wasn't room for dreaming when I was just trying to last the day. You don't have to just last anymore." "I know," she said. "That's why I said yes." That spring, they planted not just corn and beans, but squash and tobacco root, 2 seeds gifted from a Metis family that passed through on their way north. Willow traded a jar of her pickled onions and offered a place to rest their horses, while the oldest son helped Quillan repair a cracked wool hub. In the evenings, the house filled with the scrape of spoons against bowls, the rustle of pages as she read aloud from the one book her sister had left behind, a volume of prairie poems, worn thin at the corners. Quillan listened while he worked leather or sharpened tools, his eyes never leaving hers for long. One evening, after the fire had burned low, he reached across the table and took her hand. "Do you miss the places you came from?" She thought a long moment. "I miss who I thought I might have been, but not the places. They never held me the way this land does." "I'm glad you let it." "I didn't let it," she said. "It just happened." That summer, they built a smokehouse behind the barn and added a second coop for more hens. At night, they walked the fence line, not for need but for the quiet it gave them, his hand warm at her back, hers tucked into his coat when the wind rose. They lived without hurry, without waste. The land taught them that. By August, her belly had begun to round beneath her apron. She told him one morning while they were mending the porch rail, a nail held between her teeth and eyes bright with something he hadn't seen before, something soft and fierce at once. He set the hammer down and stepped back, not with surprise, but with reverence. "You sure?" She nodded. "I know what it feels like to carry nothing. This isn't that." Quillan didn't speak. He just pulled her close, one hand over the small curve below her ribs, and held her there, his cheek against her temple. When he did speak, it was just one word. "Home." They laid new floorboards in the big room that fall, one by one, her fingers still nimble though slower now. He carved a cradle from pine, smooth and strong, and she stitched a quilt from scraps of their first season together, a piece from his shirt, a strip from her dress, bits of sackcloth dyed with berries. On a night when the stars hung low and the barn was full of the hush of sleeping animals, She gave birth beside the fire, her hand clasped in his and sweat shining at her brow. It was a girl, with dark hair and a cry that sounded like wind catching in cottonwood branches. They named her Lark, for the songbirds that had returned the day before. Willow rested with the child tucked against her breath even and slow. Quillan sat beside her, one hand resting lightly on the baby's back, the other wrapped around Willow's fingers. "You did it," he said. "We did." He leaned down and kissed her forehead, then her mouth gently, like the start of morning. The days that followed were quiet. They moved around each other like dancers who knew the steps by heart. He rose early to tend the cattle and returned to find her humming as she rocked Lark in the sling she'd sewn from an old flour sack. They ate together, worked together, slept with the child curled between them, her breath soft and sure. One evening, after the first frost silvered the grass, Willow stood at the doorway, Lark in her arms, and watched Quillan return from the pasture. He looked up, saw them there, and smiled broad and unguarded. He stepped onto the porch, brushing dust from his coat, and leaned down to kiss them both. She touched his face, the lines at his eyes, the warmth in his skin. "I never thought I'd have this," she said. "You made it," he answered. "You walked into it." She shook her head, eyes full. "No, I walked until I found you." That night, they lay close beneath the quilt, the fire low and steady, their daughter asleep beside them. Wind moved gently through the trees, the stars bright above the roof, and the world, for once, felt still and whole. They stayed together all their days, raising Lark among the fields and fences they had built as one. Each season brought its work, its trials, its small joys, but through it all, they remained hand in hand, hearts steady. There was no more running, no more hunger, only home, only love, forever.